Dear students, in this lesson we're going to talk about the nervous system physiology, and then we will be talking a little bit about circulation physiology. If we look at the cells of the nervous system, a single cell of the nervous system is called a neuron. It includes dendrites, axon. It might be with a myelin sheath or without a myelin sheath. And if it has myelin sheath, within the sheath, along the sheath, there are nodes of Ranvier, and there is an axon terminal. There are also interneurons, synapses, postsynaptic cell, presynaptic cell, synaptic cleft, and axonal transport within a neuron. There are also support cells, which are mainly named the Schwann cell, satellite cells, like in peripheral nervous system, and glial cells, which are also which include the oligodendrocytes, astrocytes, and microglia like macrophages. If we look at this figure here, this is our body of the neuron, and it contains dendrites, and these dendrites act as the receiver for the neuron. Within the cell there is a nucleus and a nucleolus, as you can see in the figure. The prolongation coming backward of the neuron is called the axon, and at the end of the axon we have an axon terminal. And as you can see, the axon terminal is itself a kind of dendritic in shape, in structure. And alongside the axon, we have a myelin sheath covering the axon, and this sheath is made of mainly the Schwann's cells, which have their own nuclei. And between these sheath of the Schwann cells, we have the nodes of Ranvier. You can see that these black areas between the myelin sheath of the axon, there are nodes of Ranvier, which are very, very important in the conduction of the stimulus from the neuron to another neuron. In this slide here, we have a microscopic view of a real neuron. You can see the dendrites of the neuron, and here is the nucleus, and inside is the nucleolus of the neuron, and this part is the cytoplasm of the cell. And outside of the cell there are the supporting cells like the astrocytes, and here you can see the axon of the neuron through which the cell sends the signal to the target. If we look at the parts of a nerve cell, we have the dendrites, which receive the chemical signals from neighboring cells. We have the cell body, which contains the nucleus and the organelles of the cell, of the neuron. We have an axon, long extension, that carries electrical messages away from the body of the terminal axons. we have terminal axons, which receive the signal coming from the neuron's axon, and we have a myelin sheath wrapping around the axon, which is a protective covering for an axon. To conduct an impulse, and this impulse can be an excitatory or an inhibitory impulse, the outside of the axon becomes more negative and the inside becomes more positive. As you can see, if you consider that this is the axon of the neuron, like here, it is here, this is a part of the axon here, and the cell's electrical conduction is from this way to this way, from the neuron towards the terminal axon via the axon itself. So the outside of the axon is usually more positive, and the inside is usually more negative. But as an impulse starts to stimulate the nerve cell and an electrical impulse is started by the nerve cell, in order to transmit the signal via the axon, the outside of the axon becomes more negative and the inside becomes more positive. And thus, with this exchange of polarity, the signal traverses through the axon in only a single way, from the nerve cell itself to the terminal axon at the end. Now, the conduction itself, there are two types of conduction. One of them is normal conduction, which is also called the propagation. The conduction is also called propagation. The first one is normal conduction, and the second one is saltatory conduction. Now, when an impulse begins, is started by the nerve cell and comes to the axon in a myelinated axon, the node of Ranvier, which are the unsheathed parts of the axon, becomes positive inside and negative outside. Thus, the impulse starts to be propagated. However, this myelin sheath makes the transmission of the electrical impulse from one node to another node, regenerating the transmission again and again in every node, hence moving it very fastly along the axon. Now, here is a sketch of the axon and its terminal and the next cell's receiving unit. And we can see here how a propagated stimulus, propagated electrical potential is transferred from one neuron to another neuron. As the action potential reaches to the end, to the terminal axon, the polarization of the presynaptic terminal opens ion channels, allowing calcium to enter into the terminal axon, and this calcium entering this area triggers the release of neurotransmitters from vesicles that are present at the terminal axon. And as these neurotransmitters are discharged into the synapse of the two axons, the dendrite and the terminal axon, the postsynaptic channels receive these neurotransmitters, and opening and closing of ion channels cause change in postsynaptic membrane potential. So these neurotransmitters bind to the dendrites, to the channels of the dendrites of the next neuron, and this creates a membrane potential difference, causing it to change polarity and start again the same potential towards the target organ. It is mostly the central nervous system. And then the neurotransmitter is inactivated or transported back into presynaptic terminal, and the duty of this cell for transmitting the signal is over here, and this one's duty begins to transmit the signal to the other neuron, until it reaches to the central nervous system. So this is how our cells in the nervous system work and transmit the necessary signals to the necessary areas of the nervous system. Here you can see a GIFy representing the myelinated axon of a neuron and unmyelinated axon of a neuron. And here you can find out that once the signal is propagated from the neuron, it reaches to the terminal axon in a very fast way in myelinated axons. However, the electric impulse can only travel this much in an unmyelinated neuron when compared with the myelinated axon. Now, what's saltatory conduction? It is derived from the Latin word saltare, to hop or to leap. It is the propagation of action potentials along myelinated axons from one node of Ranvier to the next node, increasing the conduction velocity of action potentials. The uninsulated nodes of Ranvier are the only places along the axon where ions are exchanged across the axon membrane, not at the areas where they are covered with the myelin sheath, regenerating the action potential between regions of the axon that are insulated by myelin, unlike electrical conduction in a simple electrical circuit. So myelinated axons only allow action potentials to occur at the unmyelinated nodes of Ranvier that occurs between the myelinated internodes. It is by this restriction that saltatory conduction propagates an action potential along the axon of a neuron at rates significantly higher than would be possible in unmyelinated axons, as you would remember in the GIFy that I have showed you. And the speed of conduction in a myelinated axon can reach up to 150 meters per second when in comparison to unmyelinated axons, where the speed can be between 0.0 to 10 meters per second. So it's 150 meters per second to maximum 10 meters per second. You can see the difference of the speed of propagation in myelinated axons in our neurons. As sodium rushes into the node, it creates an electrical force which pushes on the ions already inside the axon. This rapid conduction of electrical signal reaches the next node and creates another action potential, thus refreshing the signal. In this manner, saltatory conduction allows electrical nerve signals to be propagated long distances at high rates without any degradation in the signal. In addition to increasing the speed of the nerve impulse, the myelin sheath helps in reducing energy expenditure over the axon membrane as a whole, because the amount of sodium and potassium ions that need to be pumped to bring the concentrations back to the resting state following each potential is decreased. Remembering from your previous lessons, the ions to be taken into the cytoplasm or to be pushed into the intercellular fluid from a cell, especially for sodium and potassium ions, there we needed a pump which was called the sodium potassium pump, and this pump consumes energy to push ions towards the inside of the cell or the vice versa. So because throughout the axons we have nodes of Ranviers, which only makes the depolarization and the movement of sodium and potassium into the axon, then the amount of energy will be reduced to exchange the ions of sodium and potassium when compared with a neuron's axon without the myelin sheath, without the nodes of Ranvier, where the exchange of the same ions would need more and more energy. But here in the myelinated axons, only at nodes of Ranvier, the exchange of sodium and potassium takes place. Hence, much less energy is consumed. Now, if we look at the parts of the nervous system, we can see that we have two main parts for the nervous system. The first one is the brain, and the central nervous system. The first one is the central nervous system, and the second one is the peripheral nervous system, which we can in short call them CNS, central nervous system, and PNS, which is the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system contains the brain and the medulla spinalis, and the peripheral nervous system contains the somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. The neurons that carry the stimulus from the sensory neurons to the central nervous system are called afferent neurons or sensory neurons. However, the neurons that carry the impulse from the central nervous system to the target are called the motor neurons. If we look at the somatic nervous system, it evaluates the external environment and rules skeletal muscles. So the somatic nervous system is basically related with the things going on outside our body. Central nervous system controls skeletal muscles via neuromuscular junctions. And to do this, it uses 12 pairs of cranial nerves and 31 pairs of spinal nerves. The nerves are so distributed in our body that if you were to be made out of nerves or the nervous system alone, you would be looking something like this. So if we look at our autonomic nervous system evaluates the internal environment. Sensory neurons connect receptors to the central nervous system, to hypothalamus and medulla oblongata, and motor neurons connect the central nervous system to effectors, organs, or the tissues. Antagonistically, the autonomic nervous system antagonistically controls the cardiac, smooth muscle, and glands for the homeostasis. and the autonomic nervous system also have some autonomic reflexes. The hypothalamus of our brain, which is this part of the brain, controls water balance, temperature, and hunger. The pons area of the brain, which is at the brain stem, this area is called the brain stem, controls mainly respiration. And the medulla area of the brain stem controls respiration, cardiac functions, vomiting, and swallowing. Autonomic nervous system evaluates internal environment. This system consists of two divisions: the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system usually controls the body antagonistically. For example, rest and digest means that the parasympathetic system is mainly active, it's dominating the body. But when we're afraid or excited and we need to fight or we need to run away, then fight or flight comes in, which then is under the domination of the sympathetic autonomous system. So the system controls the body antagonistically. When the parasympathetic system is active, your heart rate goes a little bit down, your blood pressure goes a little bit down, your guts movements are a little bit increased. However, when the sympathetic system is active, starts to dominate, if you're afraid, you don't need your guts work, so the guts working decreases, your heart starts to beat faster, your respiration increases, the blood pressure goes a little bit upward, you become fully alerted for a fight or a flight. As you can see here, we have the parasympathetic system acting on different organs, and this is how the parasympathetic system nerves come and meet with the organs. And you can see mainly the sympathetic system nerves coming and meeting with the organs, and they dominate these organs antagonistically according to the needs of the internal environment of the body. If we look at the types of neurons that we have, there are three types of neurons, which are the sensory neurons. They detect the stimuli. There are interneurons. They relay sensory signals to brain, then return message back to motor neurons. And there are motor neurons, and these pass message from the brain to rest of the body for a muscle response. This coordinated pathway is known as the reflex arc. Now, as an example, consider that you're stepping on a nail and the sensory neurons at your sole of your feet senses that you have just stepped onto a sharp thing. This very rapidly moves the signal to the interneurons in the spine, and then the interneurons send messages. That's the central nervous system, as you know, with the brain. The spine and the brain makes the central nervous system. So the neurons send messages to the motor neurons of your muscles, and then you step back of the you pull your leg off the nail. That's a reflex arc, and you can see these sensory neurons with color coding. I have tried to explain you the reflex arc. Sensory neuron taking the stimulus to the interneuron, and the interneuron processing it at the central nervous system, and then giving order to your muscles to move your feet away from the stepped nail. Now, if we look at the parts of our brain, we divide our brain into different lobes, and these lobes are known to make different jobs in our life. We have the frontal lobe. You can see the color codings. We have the parietal lobe, and we have the occipital lobe, and we have a temporal lobe. And at the back and beneath our brain, we have another lobe, but it's given a specific name. It's called the cerebellum. Now, the whole cortex of our brain is called the cerebrum, and the other small part of the brain below the cerebrum, very close to the brainstem, is called the cerebellum. The cerebellum is important because it coordinates all movements of our body. It helps maintain posture, muscle control, and balance. And the cerebrum functions for the voluntary activity, the memory, language. It receives and responds to sensory signals, and it controls motor functions of our body. Now, in a brain, in a cerebrum, when we look at a plain brain, you can see that here we have the frontal lobe, here we have the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and this is the cerebellum, and this part is going downwards, is the first the brainstem, the pons, and then comes the medulla spinalis. So if we cut the brain from the middle and look at it from one side, we can see that we have the medulla oblongata here. This is the brainstem. This part is the hippocampus, and brainstem, when we look at the brainstem here, the brainstem is responsible for controlling the swallowing, the coughing, the sneezing, and vomiting. And brainstem includes the medulla oblongata as well. This onion-like thing protruding outwards is the medulla oblongata. And the pons is the back side of the brainstem, just towards the beneath of the medulla oblongata before this medulla spinalis starts. This part is the pons part of the brainstem, and it controls the breathing, the heart rate, and internal organs functions. We also have a system within the brain that we call the limbic system. The limbic system is mainly responsible of the memory and our emotional balance, and a damage to these areas would make us to forget things, and it may affect our emotions and bring forward some emotional disturbances. Our next system of the body that we will go over in terms of physiology is the circulatory system. The cardiovascular system is the transport system of the body. It comprises of blood, heart, and blood vessels. The system supplies nutrients and oxygen to and remove waste products and carbon dioxide from various tissues and organs of the body. The conveying media is liquid in the form of blood, which flows in a closed tubular system called the vessels. The functions of the cardiovascular system is to transport nutrients and hormones, remove waste products, to make gases exchange possible. It has a close relation with immunity, and blood vessels transport blood carrying oxygen and carbon dioxide, also carries nutrients and wastes. The cardiovascular system consists of three main components. The first one is the blood itself, the heart, and the blood vessels. And blood vessels are divided into four categories: arteries, capillaries, veins, and lymphatics. The blood comprises of two main components. The cellular component contains the erythrocytes or the red blood cells, leukocytes or the white blood cells, and thrombocytes, or they're also called platelets. The plasma component is the watery part of the blood. So cellular component and plasma component makes up the blood, and it contains cellular components in it. The heart is a four-chambered, hollow muscular organ, approximately the size of your clenched fist. The location of the heart is superior surface of diaphragm, left of the midline, within the thoracic cavity. Anterior to the vertebral column, from the back there is the vertebral column, and posterior to the sternum. If we look at the X-ray of a patient, we can see the silhouette of the heart should be seen something like this. This is superimposed of a chest X-ray. It's not the exact figure. And here you can see the components of the heart that we can see on an X-ray. Like to the very left of the sternum, we can see the right pulmonary artery here going this way. This blackish part. Or we can see the superior vena cava. We can see the right atrium to the right of the sternum, and to the we can see the aortic arc at the upper part of the picture. We have the pulmonary artery, and we have the left atrium, and then we have the left ventricle. We cannot discriminate the right ventricle. Usually we cannot discriminate the right ventricle in a normal X-ray of a patient. So the heart sits on the diaphragm, and it is hanged by its bases to the greater arteries arising from the heart, and the apex of the heart, which is this part, the apex of the heart, is kind of suspended from its basis towards the apex in the mediastinal cavity. And if we look at the heart in the sketch, you can see that it sits on the diaphragm and is covered by the coats of the thorax. And if you look at it from the head towards the bottom, you can see that in the front there is the sternum, and at the back is the columna vertebralis, and the heart itself is situated in the mediastinal area of the thoracic region. And as you can see, it's very, very close to the sternum. It's almost a couple of centimeters behind the sternum, and that is why when we make resuscitations and we press the sternum squeezes the heart between the columna vertebralis and the sternum, and that's how it can pump the blood when we make the resuscitation to a patient. And we have said that the heart is a four-chambered organ. Yes, the chambers are the right atrium, the right ventricle, the left atrium, and the left ventricle. And the right ventricle pushes the blood via the pulmonary artery to the lungs, and the oxygenated blood comes via the pulmonary veins to the left atrium, and then it passes into the left ventricle, and when the left ventricle contracts, it goes into the aorta to be distributed to our head, to our arms, and to the rest of our organs and body. If we look at the functions of the heart, the heart generates the blood pressure. It routes the blood. For example, heart itself separates the pulmonary and systemic circulations. It ensures one-way blood flow, and this is made possible by the valves that are present in the heart. And it regulates blood supply. And the changes in contraction rate and force match blood delivery to changing metabolic needs. The blood vessels is a closed network of tubes which are named as arteries, capillaries, veins, lymphatic vessels. The blood vessels are the components of the circulatory system that transport blood throughout the human body. The arteries divide into smaller arteries and take the name arteriole, and the plural is the arterioles. And the arterioles further develop and form a kind of network of blood vessels, very, very, very thin blood vessels, which are called the capillaries. And capillaries are all around the cells of the tissues, around the interstitial tissue, where the capillaries pass oxygen and receive carbon dioxide, and also pass the nutrients needed by the cells, and again pass into themselves to carry away from the tissues the waste products produced by the cells after their metabolization, and then the capillaries collect together to form smaller veins called the venules, and the venules come together to form the veins in order to, and the veins carry the blood to the heart, to the right heart, for another circulation. So the arteries mainly take the blood away from the heart towards the tissues, and they pass through the capillaries. The blood enters into the veins, and the veins usually carry the blood towards the heart. The arteries and arterioles. An artery, and the plural is arteries, is a blood vessel that takes blood away from the heart to one or more parts of the body. The arteries are part of the circulatory system, which is responsible for the delivery of oxygen and nutrients to all cells, as well as the removal of carbon dioxide and waste products, the maintenance of optimum blood pH, and the circulation of proteins and cells of the human immune system. Arteries have a blood pressure higher than other parts of the circulatory system. The pressure in the arteries varies during the cardiac cycle. It is highest when the heart contracts and lowest when heart relaxes. The variation in pressure produces a pulse which can be felt in different areas of the body, such as the radial pulse. If an arteriole is a small diameter blood vessel in the microcirculation that extends and branches out from an artery and leads to capillaries. Arterioles have muscular walls, usually only 1 to 2 layers of smooth muscle, and are the primary site of vascular resistance. The greatest change in blood pressure and velocity of blood flow occurs at the transition of arterioles to the capillaries. So this area where arterioles turn into capillaries, the maximum blood pressure drop happens around here. If we talk about the capillaries, a capillary is a small blood vessel from 5 to 10 micrometers in diameter and having a wall 1 endothelial cell thick. They are the smallest blood vessels in the body. They convey blood between the arterioles and venules. These microvessels are the site of exchange of many substances with the interstitial fluid surrounding them. Substances which exist include water, the proximal portion, the arterial portion of the capillary, oxygen and glucose, substances which enter into the capillary system, which is at the venous side of the capillary or the distal portion of the capillary, include again water, carbon dioxide, uric acid, lactic acid, urea, and creatinine, which the latter are the end products of the metabolic activities taken within the cell. So if this is the proximal portion of the capillary, you can see that oxygen and nutrients move out into the interstitial fluid from the first part of the capillary, and as blood traverses towards the venous side of the capillary, carbon dioxide and wastes enter into the venous side and are carried to the venules and then to veins and then to liver and heart to be oxygenated and detoxified. Body contains two kinds of capillaries: continuous capillaries, which are found mainly in the skin, lungs, smooth muscle, connective tissue, and fenestrated capillaries, which are usually found at the pancreas, the endocrine glands, and small intestine. If we take a look at the venules and veins, a venule is a very small blood vessel in the microcirculation that allows blood to return from the capillary beds to drain into the larger blood vessels, the veins. Venules range from 7 micrometer to 1 millimeter in diameter. Veins contain approximately 70% of total blood volume, 25% of which is contained in the venules. Many venules unite to form a vein. Veins are blood vessels that carry blood towards the heart. Most veins carry hypooxygenated blood from the tissues back to the heart. Exceptions are the pulmonary and umbilical veins. Umbilical veins are found in the umbilicus of the babies when they are still in the womb, both of which carry oxygenated blood to the heart. The pulmonary arteries are exceptional arteries. Because they take blood away from the heart towards the lungs, they are called arteries, but mainly they're not in arterial configuration, but venous configuration. However, still they're called arteries because they're taking blood away from the heart towards the lungs. In contrast to veins, arteries carry blood away from the heart. Veins are less muscular than arteries and are often closer to the skin. There are valves in the most veins to prevent backflow. Because the pressure in the vein system is quite low, in order for the blood to be propelled forward only, there are some valve systems within the veins, especially within the veins of the lower extremities, to push the returning blood always towards the heart. Factors responsible for venous return are the muscle contractions, negative intrathoracic pressure, pulsation of arteries, gravity, and the valves within the veins. And we said that we also have lymphatic vessels. The lymphatic system or lymphoid system is an organ system in vertebrates that is part of the circulatory system and the immune system. It is made up of a large network of lymphatic vessels, lymphatic or lymphoid organs, and lymphoid tissues. The vessels carry a clear fluid called lymph towards the heart. Unlike the cardiovascular system, the lymphatic system is not a closed system. The human circulatory system processes an average of 20 liters of blood per day through capillary filtration, which removes plasma from the blood. Roughly 17 liters of the filtered plasma is reabsorbed directly into the blood vessels, while the remaining 3 liters remain in the interstitial fluid. One of the main functions of the lymphatic system is to provide an accessory return route to the blood for the surplus 3 liters. The other main function is that of immune defense. Lymph is very similar to blood plasma in that it contains waste products and cellular debris together with bacteria and proteins. Fluid from circulating blood leaks into the tissue of the body by capillary action, carrying nutrients to the cells. The fluid bathes the tissues as interstitial fluid, collecting waste products, bacteria, and damaged cells, and then drains as lymph into the lymphatic capillaries and lymphatic vessels. These vessels carry the lymph throughout the body, passing through numerous lymph nodes, which filter out unwanted materials such as bacteria and damaged cells. Lymph then passes into much larger lymph vessels known as lymph ducts. And there are 2 lymph ducts in the body, mainly on the right side and the left side. These ducts empty into the subclavian veins to return to the blood circulation. Lymph is moved through the system by muscle contractions. As to the circulation types within the body, we have the coronary circulation, we have the pulmonary circulation, we have a systemic circulation, and just for your knowledge, we have a fetal circulation, which is a unique type of circulation which takes place while the baby is still in the uterus before it is born, and then it changes into standard systemic and pulmonary circulation, and there is a period for that adaptation for a baby, and it's a change from the fetal circulation to other adult type of circulation. So what we will be dealing with is the coronary, pulmonary, and systemic circulations. If we look at the pulmonary circulation, this is the circulation between the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart, including the lungs in between. The hyperoxygenated blood coming to the right atrium via the veins is pumped to the lungs by the right ventricle, and as it passes through the lungs, the carbon dioxide is removed and is enriched with oxygen. Then the oxygenated blood travels to the left atrium via pulmonary veins to join the systemic circulation. Here you can see schematically, that this is the superior vena cava and this is the inferior vena cava, and this is bringing the hypooxygenated blood from the head, and this is bringing the hypooxygenated blood from the torso. They come into meet in the at right atrium, and as right atrium contracts and spills the blood into the right ventricle, then the right ventricle contracts and spills the blood into the pulmonary artery. Pulmonary artery passes through the lungs, and thanks to the capillaries within the lungs, the oxygen is given to the blood and the carbon dioxide is removed from the blood, and we exhale carbon dioxide outside our body. And when we inspire the new breath, we take inside oxygen, and hence the oxygenated blood comes via the pulmonary veins to the left atrium of the heart. That's the first red chamber here. And then this completes the pulmonary circulation. Then the pulmonary circulation is right atrium, right ventricle, pulmonary artery, lungs, and pulmonary veins to the left atrium. That completes the pulmonary circulation. This is also called the small circulation. And the systemic circulation may sometimes be called the big circulation, but we prefer to use the pulmonary circulation and the systemic circulation. And when blood comes into the left atrium, it traverses to the left ventricle of the heart, and once the left ventricle is filled with the oxygenated blood, it contracts and pushes its content into the aorta. That is the biggest artery in our body, which is responsible from distributing all the blood and anything within the blood to each and every cell of our body. And remember that we had 100 trillion cells in our bodies. So after it comes into the aorta, it is distributed to all of the body cells, including our head and our torso. That was the pulmonary and systemic circulation. Now we will be talking about the coronary circulation. Each organ has its own arteries and veins to receive oxygen and to excrete their waste products. The vessels to carry oxygen and nutrients to the heart itself are given a special name because they are all around the heart like a corona. The name coronary arteries are given to these arteries. In fact, they're the specific arteries that supply the heart itself. The coronary circulation is supported by two major arteries arising from the ascending aorta. Now, this part is the ascending aorta, and the very first arteries that are coming out from the ascending aorta are the coronary arteries themselves. The two coronary arteries are named the left coronary artery and the right coronary artery. And the left coronary artery itself, after leaving the aorta, divides into two, and one of them is named the left anterior descending artery, and the other one, turning towards the back of the heart, is named as the circumflex artery. So they are coming from a common root, which is the left main coronary artery, and they divide into two. One of them is supplying the front side of the heart, and the other one turning backwards and supplying the back of the left ventricle. These arteries are terminal arteries. They don't divide into too many arteries to form anastomosis with each other. They're terminal arteries. They get into the muscle of the heart, and each supply a certain area of the muscular system of the heart. Therefore, if any of them are blocked, the inevitable end will be the myocardial infarction. So the coronary arteries are the first branches of the ascending aorta to support the heart. The LAD, the left anterior descending artery, traverses between the left and the right ventricles and is the most important artery of the heart. The area that LAD artery supports comprises 40% of the drive force of the heart, because the apex of the heart is one of the most important driving units of the heart to push blood into the systemic circulation. In clinical practice, the patency of the LAD artery must be preserved at all costs, because if LAD goes, we usually lose the patient.